All right. Well, hey, the holiday season is coming up quick. We're almost at the end of 2021. And you know what that means? That means it's our last Sooner, Safer, Happier meetup of the year. And just thanks for joining, everybody. Really excited to catch up and learn and have a conversation this evening. And tonight, we're joined by Chris Hughes. So Chris, thank you so much for being a part of the meetup this evening. We're super excited about your topic called Safer and Sooner. So certainly speaking to the theme of better value, sooner, safer, happier, and really leaning in to the safer side of things. And, you know, Chris, I was reading up on your background a bit, and you are a well-recognized expert and thought leader in the security front. You have an amazing following on LinkedIn, I must add. And so clearly, so many of us are looking to you for, source of learning and expertise. And we're just thrilled to have you share more with us tonight at the meetup. So Chris, I'll kick it off to you for more intros and we'll get up and going.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here and grateful for the opportunity to come talk to you all. But my name is Chris Hughes. I'm currently the CISO and co-founder at a company named Aquia. But aside from that, I have about 20 years of cybersecurity experience in the public sector and private sector, with both DoD, federal government on the civilian side, and various private sector organizations. I'm also an adjunct professor at a couple of universities and graduate cybersecurity programs, and pretty active in, as you mentioned, LinkedIn, but also communities like Cloud Security Alliance and CNCF and some others. So today I'll just be talking to you all about, opportunities I've seen so far with organizations I've worked with and some innovative activities around, baking security in versus bolting it on as we often hear. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start presenting. I think you can see my screen, correct?
Yeah, it looks great. And
okay,
very interactive. So everyone, just feel free to chime in with questions along the way or conversation. We keep this super informal, just an opportunity to learn and from each other. So
awesome. All right. So I'll be talking, like I said, safer and sooner opportunities to bake in versus bolt-on security. Some of the topics I'll be touching on, of course, is going to be cloud security. Definitely a heavy focus on compliance, coming from heavily regulated industries like federal government and DoD, but also things such as infrastructure as code, compliance as code, and such. So with that said, we all know the story of compliance headaches, spreadsheets, screenshots and screen sharing. It's very tedious and monotonous, and it's often just a snapshot in time. The way I think of compliance, I have 4 young ones, and it's kind of like telling them to clean their room. When I come check, it looks great, but then as soon as I walk away, it's a massive mess again. And that's kind of how the traditional way of doing compliance is in legacy on-prem environments, for example. So how does cloud change that? A couple of things I'm going to touch on is going to be things such as the shared responsibility model, policy document templates, as well as documentation as code. I'm going to speak about reference architectures, infrastructure as code, compliance as code, and then also the new paradigm of on-demand assessment and near real-time compliance continuous monitoring, for example. So shared responsibility model, anyone that's worked with cloud, I'm sure is very familiar with this model. It also, it's good and bad. Many folks think if I'm using cloud that, the cloud provider is doing everything for me. I don't need to worry about security. It's all being done. That's definitely not the case. As you look at this model, this is from Azure, but AWS, GCP all have very similar inheritance models that you can take a look at, and responsibility models, I should say. And you can inherit quite a bit of controls, especially at the physical, level, data centers, things of that nature, personnel security and such. But you ultimately still have a lot of responsibility. But depending on your organization, the size, complexity and competence of your security and IT team, it can benefit you quite a bit to lean into that shared responsibility model and offset a lot of those responsibilities onto the cloud provider. That said, most of the cloud data leaks and data breaches we've seen occur on the customer side of the data shared responsibility model. Gartner predicts that's going to continue to occur, for, I think they said 2024, up to 95% of those. So it's definitely critical that we do our share of that shared responsibility model correct. So as I talked about, cloud service providers, they're these hyperscale global cloud service providers are providing, documentation templates for one, aligned with the various compliance frameworks, whether it's FedRAMP or NIST or SOC 2, HIPAA, et cetera. And this lets organizations take these documents, plug in your respective information, and just get off and running with already having the cloud service provider's information in there. So anyone that knows and has went through the got documentation rigmarole of compliance efforts can understand how valuable it would be to have pre-populated templates that you just go in there and introduce your organizational relevant information, for example. So OSSCAR, this is something I don't know if many people have heard of quite yet, but in the public sector, there's organizations, obviously NIST, many folks are familiar with them, but there's another organization called General Services Administration as well, GSA, that has the office that runs FedRAMP, for folks familiar with FedRAMP. And they have an effort going on called OSSCAR, which is Open Security Controls Assessment Language. Traditionally, everything in terms of documentation has been done in Word and Power, PDF documents, things of that nature, very manual, hard to do a lot of things in terms of databases and automation and such. But we're continuing to see the increased codification of everything. If you look at infrastructure as code, compliance as code, now we're seeing documentation as code with efforts like OSSCAR. And what this does is it takes your traditional, your security documentation. You think like of a system security plan, things that, discussing how you're going to audit a system or audit results from auditing a system. Much of that's typically been done manually, and on legacy, kind of like I said, Word and PDF documentation. But this brings that kind of documentation into different formats, which can be machine readable, JSON, YAML, etc. So what you're able to do is you're able to create, security control catalogs, whether you're aligning with a baseline from NIST 853 or SOC 2, HIPAA, etc., and put those into a code format. And this can be machine readable. And what the promise of this is it supports automation. So instead of manually needing to go and review all the security documentation, you can now have automated tooling that can do a lot of this for you. Obviously, some security controls are not going to automate things like, are you testing your incident response plan? Have you done tabletops? Those things are going to be interview based still. But a lot of the security controls can be put into this code format and automated via tooling. So that's definitely a promising innovation to keep your eye on in terms of the codification of documentation goes for security documentation. I also mentioned infrastructure as code, and I'll get to this in a moment in terms of how it's security relevant. But infrastructure as code, in the legacy on-premise days, you had to go and physically, stand up your infrastructure, request physical hardware, get a server rack, run cables, all these kind of things. In the cloud environment, infrastructure is increasingly becoming code, whether you're thinking, native to the service provider like AWS CloudFormation or Azure Blueprints, or you're thinking like a third-party vendor agnostic, infrastructure as code format such as Terraform, for example. And this brings a lot of benefits that traditionally have been, aligned to other code, software application code. For example, it can be version control, it can be auditable, it can be portable. So you can take these things and repeat them in many different environments. And as you'll see, you can go out there now and find infrastructure as code templates aligned with various reference architectures that you're trying to implement, or various compliance regimes that you're trying to align with and be compliant with as well. So we're going to be touching on some of that in the coming slides. And the big benefit, like I said, from a security perspective, is now you can bake in this compliance alignment into your infrastructure that you want to provision. And you'll see there's efforts underway from the cloud service providers as well as organizations like the Department of Defense to do just that and have quickly provision reference architectures that align with maybe NIST 853 at the moderate or high level, or FedRAMP, et cetera. So building on that same concept of infrastructure as code, we have compliance as code. So that's taking infrastructure as code further and starting to implement, what is often dubbed as guardrails. Part of the issue, with security is like it's always kind of bolted on, as we said. It's kind of brought in after the fact and kind of can be a major impediment to, release cadence and the speed of things. But what if you can implement guardrails into the infrastructure as code concept and have things such as CI/CD pipelines that are running policies against these infrastructure as code templates that are getting pushed to production environments, and seeing does it align with the CIS benchmark? Does it align with, the FedRAMP requirements or NIST 853 or HIPAA, whatever your requirements are, for example. So that's something critical to keep an eye on, and that we'll be talking about in a moment. And then also, beyond just infrastructure as code, we're seeing obviously the rapid proliferation of things like Kubernetes from a container orchestration perspective. You can also run this, these compliances code checks against things such as Kubernetes manifests, Istio manifests as well. And that's certainly promising. And it can run from all the way, whether it's part of a pipeline, a part of a runtime environment, and then even some of the companies now are even supporting IDE integration, things like Bridgecrew. If you look at them, they were just acquired recently by Palo Alto, for example, and they now have support to where even in the developer's IDE environment, you can be having these checks run for various, whether it's CIS, whatever compliance framework you're trying to align with. So that's certainly a way to shift security left, decrease some of the burden down the road, catch security considerations or findings or vulnerabilities, et cetera, misconfigurations earlier in the life cycle, and just minimize the pain and the resources required to resolve them.
Hey,
So
Chris.
building on the infrastructure is, yeah,
Hey, Chris, quick question on that. Just one thing
yeah.
that we're looking at in our organization. This might be a little broader or looks at a different angle in this is when we look at like our, we have lots of stuff in the cloud, but we also have an on-prem presence for our company, and we've started a journey to further automate some of the standard services that are provided across like our engineering and architecture disciplines across the company. An example might be like firewall as a service. And one of the things we're starting to do is we're starting to put, like you were mentioning, the guardrails. So in order to either automate or self-service things that we used to have to do manually, we're trying to empower others across the organization to own that service for themselves, like applying a firewall rule, for example. But in order to do that, we're starting to inject those policies that I think you're talking about, these guardrails that wouldn't allow that service to actually happen unless it fits within those the security constraints. And I'm just wondering how much that fits in the compliance as code arena, or is that considered something separate?
No, it can certainly be part of that discussion, depending like how you're implementing these things or letting people self-service them. For example, if you're using AWS and you're using like CloudFormation to allow people to, provision infrastructure as code via CloudFormation, you can have checks in there, whether you're using like some of the tools I'll actually discuss here in a moment, like Terrascan and Bridge Crew and some of the others, as well as, some of the AWS tooling, even I think CFN Lint and CFN Nag are some of the, kind of linting and security checks you can run for CloudFormation, for example. But you can check and see, like if they're, say they're provisioning a VPC and they want to implement some security security rules to allow networking, for example, you can allow only certain ports and protocols, only from certain sources and destinations. So that definitely can be part of that conversation for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Awesome. So, building on the infrastructure as code concept, we're seeing a push now for GitOps, and which is, taking that DevOps, best practices approach in terms of version control, configuration drift, things being immutable and repeatable, and moving towards this model where infrastructure as code now is being pushed through that same CI/CD pipeline type model, where rather than folks going in manually to the, say the AWS or Azure console and making manual changes, which lead to quite a bit of drift and unauthorized, configurations, is pushing that infrastructure as code through the same CI/CD pipeline that I just talked about, same kind of model, and only managing infrastructure in your cloud environment in that context. So this is a great way to implement, like I said, DevOps best practices, but on the infrastructure as code front, preventing unauthorized changes, invalid changes, like you were just talking about, maybe firewall rules, for example. So that's part of the capability in terms of GitOps. And it also facilitates what I was just discussing in terms of the compliance as code, because you can now have that integrated, whether it's in the developer IDE environment, part of a pipeline, or part of even a runtime environment. If someone was able to bypass, the CI/CD environment, for example, and go in and make an unauthorized change in your cloud environment, you can have that constant, declarative reconciliation, like that loop of determining, does my environment align with what my infrastructure as code has declared? And if not, it can reconcile that and bring it back into, alignment and compliance, for example. So as I talked about reference architectures, these infrastructure as code templates, you can quickly take these and they're aligned with like your various compliance frameworks, as I said, aligned with reference architectures you may need to meet based on your organizational best practices or guidance. And these can expedite customer activities, whether you're thinking customer from the perspective of a cloud service provider consumer, or even internal stakeholders and customers across the organization. Being able to put these things in that codified format lets you do like some of the self-service activities that Dan just mentioned and speed up your activity, and something that you would normally have to do manually. Be very, it would be kind of be one-off and bespoke each time it was done. This time it could be done in a very repeatable pattern. It's being provisioned, what it aligns with, what it's putting in place, what kind of configurations are there, all those kind of things as well. So obviously there's this big push big push in cybersecurity at the moment, and IT in general, shift security left. So when you think about that GitOps model, the infrastructure as code that we just talked about, what better way to shift left than you're talking all the way up to maybe the developer's IDE environment, for example, when it comes to infrastructure as code and moving towards a GitOps model. That's about as far left as you're going to shift, other than things such as threat modeling and things like that. So pipeline security tooling is something I wanted to touch on as well. Let me get, I think I have a bar in front of my screen here. Hopefully you all can still see it. So pipeline security tooling, if you're looking at DevOps and DevSecOps environments now, right? Some people argue, security was always part of DevOps, but here we are. We have DevSecOps that people are typically discussing at this point. There's a great opportunity to push security left through that CI/CD pipeline, and there's a lot of functional areas that you need to cover. When you build out a robust tool chain, including from a security perspective. And this isn't like everything that you could possibly do, but this is some of the main primary functional categories you might start to look at. Whether it's running SaaS and DAST, on application code being pushed through that environment. Same concept with the infrastructure as code scanning, as we just talked about, and I'll be talking about again. Doing things such as secret scanning. We've seen many cases where individuals are putting secrets out into an environment, especially these cloud environments, right? And they can be abused if they're disclosed to malicious actors or even inadvertently disclosed and kind of taken advantage of. So there's things such as Git leaks, Truffle Hog, and some other tooling you can run on that front to capture some of those secrets and ensure they're not being exposed in the way they shouldn't be. As I talked about, compliance as code. Another term is often used as policy as code, same kind of concept, and manifest scanning things, like I said, like your Terraform configuration files and templates, scanning your Kubernetes manifest, your Istio, YAML documentation, for example. So all those policy as code, compliance as code and manifest scanning capabilities are something that you can move into that tool chain and have those captured before they ever get to the runtime environment. They're much cheaper to resolve. They never have been put into a runtime environment to be, taken advantage of by a malicious actor, for example. Another big area, obviously, is software composition analysis. Looking at, we're seeing more and more consumption of open source software, which is great. It's a great dynamic environment with a lot of contributors, but there's not the same, security rigor in some cases. Maybe it's a project just maintained by an individual and they're not putting much time into making secure code. And you've been consuming components of that, for example, performing software composition analysis and seeing, what components are we using, see if there's any licensing implications and security implications for some of the components that you're using in your software. Also, container vulnerability scanning. Some of the organizations I've been working with, some of you may have heard or not, but in DoD, some of the more reputable, visible ones are organizations known as like Platform One, for example, which is one of the leading DoD DevSecOps software factories. They've moved towards a container paradigm. But with that said, there's a great benefit to containers. You can have them immutable and repeatable, and you can harden them and have them reusable across organization. But you definitely need to be performing that container vulnerability scanning as things are being built and pushed through the pipeline, for example. And then, of course, we're seeing a lot of activity right now coming out of organizations like NTIA, as well as CISA, in terms of software bill of materials, right? Seeing what exactly is in the software that you're using. The way they typically refer to it as is think of it like a nutritional label. Seeing like what exactly is in the thing that I'm consuming. Because traditionally organizations don't have much visibility into that. It has benefits from a consumer perspective to make sure you have understanding of what you're consuming, what those components look like, what are you ingesting and introducing into your environment. And then also, from a producer perspective, there's organizations out there like Jupiter One. If you've ever heard them, they've basically open sourced their SBOM. You can go to like Jupiter One/SBOM or something like that, I think it is, and see their SBOM in real time. It's just out there for you to view, so that if you're using them, you have full visibility into what you're consuming. And that's a great thing in terms of a transparency perspective around software, both from a consumer and a producer perspective. So as I talked about, when you think of compliance traditionally, that snapshot in time, I don't know if anyone's worked in auditing or compliance roles, but it often involves, screen sharing. We're going to do some sampling, right? We can't, so you have 300, 500 systems. We can't test all of them. We're going to do a subset of that. That's not really giving you real. This is where the phrase, compliance doesn't equal security. It's because of those realities that people make those kind of assertions, right? But in the cloud environment where everything is API driven on demand, you can go in there and now conduct near real time compliance assessments to check for things such as, drift detection from, say you had a good compliant state, you've had some drift occur, you can have notifications and visibility of that now. You can also run these at intervals that align with your organizational or your regulatory requirements. Like, we need to perform compliance, compliance assessments at X interval. You can have that going on a near real-time basis and provide that to external auditors or internal auditors, to see how your compliance alignment is. And no longer do you have to do sampling, right? It can be done in your entire environment in the cloud, not in a snapshot in time. No more screenshots, emailing documentation and artifacts around. It could be near real time, on demand, and presented into a dashboard that you can present up to leadership or auditors, whether internal or external, for example. And I'll talk about some of the cloud service provider services facilitating that. So on the Azure front, for folks that are working with Azure, they have what's called Azure Security Center. This is a very robust service that they have natively. It provides support for various, compliance frameworks. I don't want to name them all, but all the big ones you can definitely think of. You can see this in a near real-time dashboard, and you can also see your scoring, how you're trending. What do you need to fix to improve your compliance score, for example? And then if you do have requirements to export reporting, you're able to generate, exportable PDF reports, for example, or other documentation formats for as well to share, with auditors or those you need to provide on your leadership and such like that. And then AWS, they have a very similar service called AWS Audit Manager that they just announced. I want to say it's been less than a year at this point, if I'm not mistaken. But AWS Audit Manager does something very similar. It can look at your near real-time assets that you have running in AWS, all your virtualized, compute, whether it's EC2 or containers, or maybe even Lambda functions for many organizations, and provide that visibility in terms of how we're aligned with our various compliance frameworks. And then you can even push to what we're seeing called auto remediation, right? If you have non-compliant resources, whether it's non-compliant with a regulatory framework or non-compliant with like a custom internal compliance framework that you've created based on your organization, you can auto remediate those non-compliant resources and bring them back into alignment with your compliance and security requirements. So that's an opportunity, beyond the CI/CD aspect. Now we're talking runtime environments, real-time environments, production environments, and bringing those into alignment to move away from that kind of tedious snapshot in time manual activity that we often think of when we think of compliance. There's also third-party solutions that do this as well, and I'll be talking about one of them in a moment. There's an organization called Curex. They were just recently bought by Tenable, for example. BikeCheck is another organization that's doing this. They're heavily focused on SOC 2. So definitely, if you have SOC 2 requirements, give them a look. And also Breakthrough, as I mentioned, which is bought by Palo Alto. These organizations are great if you have like a multi-cloud scenario. For example, you don't want to have to manage AWS Audit Manager and manage Azure Security Center independently and try to reconcile those findings. Using a third-party, vendor agnostic solution or CSP agnostic solution, I should say, kind of lets you have that multi-cloud visibility and compliance perspective, which many organizations are doing nowadays in terms of multi-cloud. So here's a look at some of these, for folks who haven't seen like Azure Security Center, for example. It'll tell you the number of controls that you're trying to meet to, say in this case, the Azure Security Benchmark, right? It also can give you visibility of SOC or PCI, and you can see the exact control families, the control identifiers, where you're deviant from those, what do you need to do to bring your organization, your environment, your cloud workloads in alignment with those, unless you continuously assess your environment in terms of security and compliance, which is a major shift from how we've traditionally done it in legacy environments, for example. AWS Audit Manager, same thing. The great thing about this is you can use industry frameworks like SOC 2 or PCI or FedRAMP, et cetera, CIS benchmarks and such, but you can also create custom. Many organizations have custom compliance frameworks. For example, I support Center for Medicare and Medicaid at the moment, and they have a custom compliance framework that's kind of a mix of NIST and also HIPAA, and for example, there's security controls that get pulled from different frameworks. So you can create a custom compliance framework that you want to use within your environment and constantly run your cloud workloads against that, your cloud security environments against that, and get visibility, get alerting, produce those automated reports that you want to provide to internal and external auditors or leadership, to give that level of comfort in terms of how compliant and secure your environment is based on whatever your particular frameworks and requirements are. Also, another thing that I definitely want to mention is AWS Conformance Packs. This is very similar to Audit Manager, except for, in here, you can go in and implement what's called remediation actions. So you can have like those auto remediation actions if you have environments that are non-compliant or deviating from some of the, guardrails, as we talked about previously. You can use these config rules to go in there and auto remediate resources to bring it back in alignment with those guardrails that we talked about previously. So this is definitely a shift from, mainly having to go assess the environment, see where you're compliant, and then mainly having to fix, findings that you find. Now you're automating not only the assessment and audit aspect, but you're automating the remediation in many cases where it's possible. So I talked about Department of Defense, and the reason I want to call this out is this is pretty innovative. For public sector gets a bad rep in many cases, of trailing behind industry. But there's some innovative efforts going on, and one of them I want to talk about is DoD's Cloud Infrastructure as Code effort is running out of their cloud computing program office that they have. They've basically went and built. I talked about infrastructure as code templates and baselines, for example. They've went and built infrastructure as code baselines for both AWS and Azure in their native formats of Azure Blueprints and AWS CloudFormation. And you can go in there and take these and run them at whatever classification level you need to run at, whether you're talking secret, top secret, or unclassified. And you can run those infrastructure as code templates and quickly get a pre-provisioned compliant environment that comes with an authorization from a senior risk executive, who's kind of pre-approved these infrastructure as code templates to be created, and you inherit those controls as we discussed from the cloud service provider, whether at the IaaS or platform as a service level, depending on what level of consumption you have in the cloud environment. And it comes with both of these also come with out of the box real-time compliance monitoring and assessment using the native services I just talked about with Azure Security Center, AWS Audit Manager, for example. So you get a pre-provisioned environment aligned with your security controls, your security requirements, your compliance requirements, and then you can automate your assessments and auditing of those in near real time. So definitely pretty innovative from a security compliance perspective. I mentioned a Curex earlier. We talked about, pushing things to the CI/CD environment, right? Even having IDE checks depending on the tooling and the software. So a Curex is really promising. This company has 1,500 policies aligned with 10 different standards. I listed some of them here that we've talked about: SOC 2, CIS, etc. So if you're running things like, you have a Docker manifest, Azure ARM templates, Helm charts, all the ones you can see here, and they have more support if you go look at their website, for example, Kubernetes manifest, etc., CloudFormation. You can go ahead and detect and remediate things as they're going through that CI/CD pipeline. You can have this webhook, this check running against your what you're pushing through that pipeline, and catching things that are either non-compliant or maybe just a vulnerable configuration that you're not comfortable letting into the production environment. And then also moving beyond that, it can go in and look at your runtime environment and do the same kind of thing. Do you have something that maybe someone went and made a manual change? They weren't supposed to do that outside of CI/CD pipeline, for example, but they went and made a manual change. It can detect and remediate them, to bring it back in compliance and security alignment, which is pretty promising. So this is kind of my wrap-up slide here. Compliance in the cloud, I call it a new paradigm versus what we've typically seen on premise. You look at things like I talked about: infrastructure as code, compliance as code, all the integrated security tooling you can bring into the CI/CD environment, shifting security left, and often empowering developers. When we look at the cloud native environment, in many cases, like the developer, is almost owning more and more of the stack, if you think about it, right? When they're pushing Kubernetes manifest, application code, infrastructure as code, all these kind of things that they're now able to push into environments, empowering them by integrating that security tooling into the CI/CD tool chain can really go a long way to bake in security, catch things before they get to a production environment where it's far cheaper, takes less resources, both in manpower and money, to resolve them, and also never lets them get to a point where an adversary can actually exploit them. So that's kind of my last slide. And after that, open up to questions or just to chat if anyone wants to chat on any of these topics.
Cool. Chris, great topic. Wow. That's a lot of stuff in there. There are things there that are new for me. So I have to actually process this. I can't wait to watch it again afterwards. I had one quick question to open up for everybody. Yeah, this is great. Is the auto remediation side, I think, is really promising what you're sharing there, because as I looked across a lot of organizations, the typical way of working, some of this is hopefully in the past in a number of cases, is that you've got organizations that are writing code, trying to get stuff delivered, new features, in their products, but then security becomes the afterthought, right? But then you may have like a security ops organization that runs scanning tools and goes in and does some of that regular auditing and scanning and then provides the findings. But then we have to, organizations have to provide some type of, maybe incentives the wrong word, but that there has to be a joint focus on improving security while we also, look to deliver new features in our products. I'm just curious how much you're seeing the auto remediation side, out there now, because that sounds so promising to me that you could auto remediate a number of things versus having to take it on manually. So what have you learned there? What would be good for us to know?
Yeah, honestly, I've seen a mixed bag, depending on the severity of like the configuration, drift or compliance deviation. Some of them I've seen be pretty straightforward from an auto remediation perspective, and others, people are reluctant to auto remediate because it can be disruptive, right? So it's one of those things that's very promising, but I think as it matures, it'll become more widespread and more adopted. But right now, people are very hesitant, because it doesn't always go as planned, right? It changes something and it breaks something it wasn't intended to break. But the promising part is that we do have the ability to start looking to do these kind of things where traditionally, like you said, there's a finding. Okay, now we got to pass it on to someone else who can go take a look at it and maybe coordinate a time when they maybe don't make a change or even see if they should make a change. Now we can put these things into codified format and try to push towards auto remediation to keep us in that compliance secure state at all times. But like everything in our industry, it's going to take some time to mature for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if it auto remediates something incorrectly, that could actually create more risk and more manual work.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
you
So
know,
I think I've seen folks, some findings, depending on the severity or what it is, they will auto remediate it if it's a very, severe, security change, for example. But others, they've kind of tread carefully. So it just depends, I think, based on what I've seen.
cool. We'll open up for others who'd like to weigh in or have some comments or feedback or questions.
Hey, Chris, this is just super. Really good job. Appreciate it. I'm glad I'm here. Hey,
Yeah,
just a passing comment. I'm trying to find it now. A couple of days ago, I saw an interview that discussed why shift left wasn't going to happen. There was too much friction. And I'm still chewing on some of the points that were made, but it came to mind when you were talking. Thanks again.
That's interesting. Yeah, no worries. It's interesting. I think when someone says it isn't going to happen, I think it already is happening to some extent, but doesn't mean it's totally seamless and tensionless. In every organization I've seen, depending on the personalities involved and the tooling and ownership and egos and how it can be in large organizations. But it is definitely happening in terms of integrating security tools into the tool chain, for example. I've seen many organizations starting to do that and try to tackle findings earlier in the life cycle. But I think, what we're also seeing is not just a shift left, but there's also, day two ops, there's runtime environment. So like, you're not going to catch everything and you're not always going to control everything from a CI/CD perspective and integrating tooling into the earlier the life cycle. So you need to now, I hate to say shift left and right, but it really is like you need to have, catch things earlier in the life cycle if you can, but you're not always going to do that. So be prepared for incidents because they will and will occur for sure.
Of course, yeah, I've come from a software development background. I think the point that was being made was that code developers are under pressure and they just want to get their stuff to work right and they don't care about security. Oh, we'll worry about that afterwards. And it's a hard thing to break out of.
Yeah,
It's
I can
not that
tell
it
you
isn't
from doing
happening.
now I can tell you from doing security for almost 20 years, like I've dealt with that. And it's super frustrating on the security side, right? Because you feel like, is security a priority? Leadership may say it is, but when it comes time push for shove, and things need to get out the door and or you even find something in production, right, that's vulnerable and it needs to be addressed, do you get the opportunity to address it? So I think, it's kind of that age-old paradigm where, sometimes we hear security is a priority, right? Like someone just said, I think Chuck just said it, like it's not a priority until there's an incident and they're like, oh, we need to take the security thing seriously, yeah.
Yeah, Chris, I think one of the things that I thought I was kind of noting out, do you feel like we're talking about like DevOps, we talk about observability and monitoring in production. Do you feel like we're getting that way with the security tools as well? You kind of touched on that a little bit. That kind of sparked my mind a little bit. That's kind of part of some of the same stuff.
I think we're getting there, depending on the context. Like you look at it as like, a lot of things I talked about there. If you think of like native CSP services, it's almost like cloud security posture management, if you've heard of that term, knowing that we have, 95% of security breaches in the cloud occurring due to customer misconfigurations and vulnerable configurations. I think, things such as cloud security posture management, SaaS security posture management is definitely becoming big now. I've talked about that a lot lately. Organizations, we're using, say you're using like, Dan, just to use you as an example, you guys may be using Azure and AWS, right? But how many SaaS apps are you using? Probably tens to hundreds. Large enterprises, I think it says up to roughly 280, depending on how large the enterprise is. So it's pretty massive. But we're seeing cloud security posture management, SaaS security posture management. Those are giving us definitely more observability from a security perspective on how our environments are, how our workloads are. So we're getting there. I think we're getting there. It's obviously it's taking time.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I was pausing to see one other thing that I was thinking about this, Chris and others, and I was actually looking at this and how we do this in our organization today is when we look broadly, and in this particular case, we've got, I don't know, roughly 500 Scrum teams across company working on a lot of different software products. We work really hard to shift a lot of things left. It takes a village for sure at that size and scale. But one of the things we do is we actually have our version of an outcomes dashboard that we use in our enterprise technology organization. And we look at a certain set of security outcomes that they're macro level, but we can filter them down to make it more context specific right across the organization. It was part of the comment earlier. It was sort of, we do this to help drive a collective sense of urgency and focus on improving the security posture of the software products that we work on and provide in the marketplace, so that it's a first-class citizen, if you will, relative to everything else that we focus on, primarily around new feature development. And I was just curious, in your travels, Chris, what are some of the, I don't know, maybe macro level security outcomes or safer, outcomes of safer that you're seeing in organizations that they are choosing to operationalize through a metric so that it can be measured, we can, use it to learn, right, and adapt and continue, and probably in some cases improve and heighten the focus.
Yeah, this is definitely a hot topic. And I see Patrice asked a question in the chat I want to answer too, but it's always like, there's a lot of conversation right now in terms of, how do we pitch security as like a business enabler rather than a cost center, rather than like, people dread interacting with security, right? Because it's going to be this terrible experience, and you're going to hear no to everything you want to do. So I think it's kind of like on security leaders to try to tell that story and narrative of how security is a business enabler. And I think as we look at organizations, increasingly, every company is almost a technology company, right? And all that technology needs to be integrated with cybersecurity. So I think, if you can communicate that to leadership in terms of how you're protecting organizational brand, how you're protecting revenue, and enabling the organization to go out and pursue new opportunities for revenue creation and generation and such, can really go a long way. But it's like, it's that effort of needing to communicate that to the organization and tie it to key business objectives. Because they're not going to really care, necessarily how many vulnerabilities you remediated, and some of those security specific metrics that business leaders aren't too interested in. You need to tie it to, in my experience, to be effective, is tied to business objectives and business outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and show how security support those. I think there's a comment just came in that says security will. He's sharing a comment. This goes back to what he mentioned, I think, a recent interview about security never being a priority, basically, in software development. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. There was a study last year, I think it was, between Linux Foundation and a Harvard entity that showed, developers, free and open source developers, for example, spent like less than 2% of their time on anything security related. When you think of how many open source components we're consuming, that's kind of alarming, right? Because they're not taking much time to secure those components that we're consuming. So, and I know Patrice also made a comment She said, what's your view on evolution of tools and technologies to help triage and prioritize vulnerabilities that should be remediated? And part of what I'm seeing that's a challenge too is like, I think it was Chuck who made the comment about observability. We have all these great tools I talked about, secret scanning, SBOM, software composition analysis, SAS, DAS, et cetera. These things are all producing a lot of telemetry, right? So your security teams, they have a lot of data, a lot of great insight, but it's like, what do we do with all this data? How do we act on it? What telemetry should we use to actually, break a build or stop a build, push for production? Because, if we do that, everyone's obviously going to get upset at us. So defining those gates and those metrics in terms of what's acceptable or not for our organization is a real challenge for a lot of folks, because you have so much information now. But, how do you use it in an effective and productive manner without being too disruptive is kind of the balancing point you're trying to reach. Let's see, I'm reading some comment from Jay too. So he says, one of my clients is a fast growth legal tech startup that is early on in their life, in their journey. Now they have 250K SaaS clients. They're having their first incidents. So when you say they have 250K, do they produce a SaaS product that people are purchasing and using? Is that what that is?
Yeah, in the legal space. And
okay,
they're just getting big enough now that they're having incidents, and now they're like, okay, we got to get serious. So, but they're still small enough that, like, what would the adoption curve? Where would they start, or begin to think about how to modernize and roadmap? They're small enough.
In terms of security
people,
perspective, you mean?
Yeah, to try to really develop the whole pipeline, like you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, from a pipeline perspective, definitely look into some of the functional areas that I talked about in capturing, some of those security metrics, around SaaS, DAS, secrets, et cetera. But from a program perspective, you can look to industry guidance like NIST cybersecurity framework, CSF, for example, in terms of how you can approach and mature, security program. But it's definitely challenging with an organization that's small. They likely don't have many, if any, security people. They can look to either bringing in, people working with a managed service provider or partner, cybersecurity service provider, or even having a fractional CISO in many cases come in and try to give some guidance on how they can start to build out a security program. I've seen a lot of fractional CISOs being quite successful, helping organizations smaller like them who can't, don't demand necessarily a full-time CISO, but need some, cybersecurity leadership to come in and give that guidance on how they start to prepare for this. Because as you see, like they have 250,000 clients. If they don't have any, incident response, business continuity, any kind of cybersecurity maturity and rigor, that 250,000 client base can be impacted if they start to lose trust in you. You start to lose reputational brand. Those can have major impacts from a business perspective.
Yeah, fractional CISO. That's a great idea. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. We'll open up for any other questions or feedback here this evening.
Out of curiosity, before you guys all take off, what kind of industry and organizations are you all coming from?
Oh, great question.
IT consulting.
Okay.
So I'm an agile coach who dabbles in a lot of the DevOps stuff, but I deal with clients, and security has been a hot topic, at least for mine, for the last couple of years. And recently come with some of our clients. So I'm just trying to kind of dabble to kind of keep my toes wet with some of this stuff, knowing how important it is. And I mean, we've been doing this stuff for, SolarWinds was just this time last year, right? So
yeah. I mean, we're definitely seeing it come more front and center in the public sector. We've seen the cybersecurity executive order, which is a whole slew of tasking for federal agencies, and we're seeing things come out, NSA and CISA and others. And I know private sector is struggling with the same kind of things, especially things like cybersecurity supply chain concerns. So it's challenging to keep up with it all, to be honest with you. Like you're not even necessarily working in security, but you're trying to keep up with it. I can tell you, even working in security, it's tough to be, it's such a diverse and dynamic landscape. You can't be an expert in all aspects of it.
Yeah, we are. I'll add to that I work at Cox Automotive, and a lot of the company really does provide software products in the automotive space that run like car dealerships, for example. They also run our wholesale Mannheim auctions, which gets into the financial services side of it. Like we've got all that. We have digital retailing solutions where you can essentially shop, find your next dream car, make the whole purchase and work through that whole workflow now in a digital way. So, really architecting for security, shifting to the left is a continued emphasis for us, because we've gone global, and as you mentioned, it helps sustain and continue to build trust with our clients. We have tens of thousands of clients, right? Car dealers all over North America and beyond. So this is all constantly top of mind. We do have in the organization, I mentioned earlier, we have lots of Scrum teams work on a lot of cool products across the company. But we also have our version of an enterprise risk and security team for the company. And I get the opportunity to work with that team, and so it's part of what was mentioned earlier, where I think, Chris, you just mentioned it, that we can't be experts in all things in all ways, but I think scaling that expertise is something that we've had to work really hard on. Like, how do we make that work so we can provide the appropriate amount of expertise and guidance and oversight, and in some cases rationalization of tools, so we don't have too much of a proliferation of tools where there's point solutions all over the place. So we've also that's been an effort that we've been on for a while now, because we have a lot of mergers and acquisitions over the years as well. So that's a little bit about what our organizations. This is, I can't wait to point everyone to your talk, because I would love to check this out.
Yeah, as I said, it's really insightful to hear, the different industries you guys are in. And I'll tell you, like, I think it was Chuck, it might have been Chuck, or who was it? Let's see. It might have been Jay. I think his organization mentioned like 50 people, right? And they have no security representation quite yet. There's even, I went through a course from an organization called Digital Directors Network, if you guys want to check that out. It's run by an individual named Bob Zukas. And what he did is he started producing studies showing that even at the board level, digital savvy and cybersecurity savvy organizations are performing better in the marketplace. So not only are small organizations having that challenge, but large organizations, massive, multinational conglomerates have no security representation on the board in most cases. Despite overwhelmingly using technology to facilitate their business and build a brand and generate revenue, they have no security representation in many cases at the board level. So it's organizations of all shapes, sizes that are running into this struggle, to be honest.
But it is really something.
Yeah. Well, if no other questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat about these things and hear about different things that organizations are struggling with, or where I can maybe lend some advice or even learn something. Like I said, it's such a massive ecosystem, different problems and solutions, and always eager to chat with anyone.
That's cool, Chris. Great topic tonight. It was excellent. We all learned a lot. Saw the comment earlier. My brain is full. I'm like, my brain overfloweth. I imagine all of our brains are overfloweth right now. Covered a very broad and diverse landscape of tools and technologies on how to deliver safer and sooner. So I thought that was pretty clever topic name too. So good stuff. Yeah. Well, Chris,
I appreciate
everyone, it. Yeah, you betcha. We're great to have you here tonight, and happy holidays to everyone. So great to have you all here for the last meetup of the year, and we'll be picking back up, at the beginning of 2021, and continue our meetups next year. So we're looking forward to it. So I hope everyone has some time off and a great break, and we'll see you all next year.
Sounds good. Take care.
Cool.
Thank you, Dan, for putting this together.
Everyone.